from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
As we tape this program today, the Pacific Northwest Political Science Association is meeting in our city of Coeur d'Alene. We're delighted that they're here, and we're taking advantage of the fact they're here to interview some of the political scientists to share with our wonderful viewers what they're doing in our city and what they're talking about. As a political scientist myself, I'm delighted when they come to town, and I can't think of anything more exciting than interviewing political scientists. And today we have two very distinguished guests from that association. I first of all welcome to the program Dr. Lisa Carlson from the University of Idaho, where she teaches political science, and she holds a PhD in the field of political science from Rice University. Dr. Carlson, it's been a pleasure talking with you before the program, and we're excited about the topic, and thank you for coming and being with us today.
Thank you.
And I'm also equally pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Richard Moore, who is from Lewis-Clark State College, and he holds a PhD from the University of Arizona, and I've known Dr. Moore a long time. We worked together on a number of projects, and Dr. Moore, it's nice of you to come. And I also want to say that over these 2 weeks we've done this program, you've been very good to help us bring these political scientists together, and we thank you.
My pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, our topic for today's program is global politics, and they are so highly qualified to discuss that. I, in fact, am so excited about what we're doing that we're going to ask them to come back at a later date in the year to continue. We can't do it all in 30 minutes. And as always, I'm so pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho. We shall ask Janelle to commence today's discussion of global politics.
Dr. Carlson, let's begin our program today with you. There are a number of locations around the world where there's conflict and where there's excitement and where there is a lot of attention being given to the problems that exist in those areas. The Middle East is one of those areas, perhaps the most important spot in the whole world in terms of what's going on now. Can you comment on what is indeed happening and what some of the theories are with regard to how to get and obtain a peaceful resolution?
Okay. You've asked me about one of perhaps the most intractable conflicts in the international system. We've witnessed the end of the Cold War. We've witnessed South Africa moving into a different regime, and yet the Middle East doesn't seem to change a whole lot. One of the difficulties that we had is that it seems as if the Middle East peace process has gone off track since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in November of 1995. One of the things that is happening now is that the Palestinians continue to accuse the Israelis of subverting the Oslo Peace Accords and the spirit of those agreements by continued Jewish settlement building, withdrawal of troops at non-scheduled times and things of this nature. By the same token, the Israelis continue to accuse Arafat of not controlling the terrorist elements within the occupied territories and have argued until he does that, there can really be no discussion. So the peace process has degenerated significantly, and I think part of the reason for that is most experts in the field will argue that the Labor Party in Israel and the Likud Party, which is presently in power, have radically different conceptualizations of what peace means. That is to say that Labor, had it remained in power, probably would have proceeded with the Oslo Accords as they had been set forth, and we would see a steady progress toward peace in the Middle East. Likud came in with a very different conceptualization of what peace meant, and that has been the more, I think, old-style, traditional, coercive style of dealing with the Palestinians. There's a real fear of giving the Palestinians a homeland, that it will be a staging ground for attacks against Israel. The question is, how do you get the peace negotiations back on track? And I think one of the things that people have argued, there's several theories about how you deal with this issue. One is that perhaps you need a very strong international mediator to get the parties back on track. Traditionally, that role has been filled by the United States. But I think, as Madeleine Albright's visit to the Middle East recently showed, it is very difficult for the United States to twist the arms of either party simply because we do not have necessarily the power over them. We can't translate that power into influence in the Middle East. Plus, you have a very strong contingency within the United States that puts pressure on the United States to pursue a particular path. So that becomes one possible solution to get the parties going. Another solution that has been proposed is looking down the road. Perhaps if the Middle Eastern countries would become democratic, then there would be a real chance for peace. And the underlying assumption of this particular proposal is what is known in the field as the democratic peace. This is one of the few laws that we have in the social sciences, analogous to, say, a law in the physical sciences, where we've discovered that democracies do not go to war against other democracies, but they go to war against everybody else. So there's something about democracies that makes them negotiate their differences peacefully. And there's maybe two reasons for that. One, people have argued there's a political culture reason. We have norms of peaceful conflict resolution. Winner and losers, winning does not mean that the loser is eliminated. Things of this nature, equality and justice and so forth. There's others who argue that the institutions themselves constrain leaders from making aggressive choices in the system. And so it's the institutions of democracy that constrain leadership choices. Whichever explanation it is, we're not sure what it is. Democracy seems to be a force for peace. But, and this will be my sort of last point on the matter, there's a complicating factor here. And the complicating factor is that some people have argued the reason that democracies are peaceful is because they a priori have settled their territorial disputes. That is what has allowed them to become democratic and peaceful. If, say, for instance, if Germany and France still were fighting over Alsace-Lorraine, it really wouldn't matter whether they were democracies. They might not be democracies. So the democratic peace theory, given that complication, might not hold for the Middle East. You might have to resolve what I see as the territorial issues first before they could become democratic. So we don't know if that would be a viable solution or not. There's many Middle East experts who would argue that democracy in the Middle East would look radically different than what we conceptualize in the West as democracy anyway. So
I'm going to give Dr. Moore maybe a chance to react to some of what Lisa said. It's so interesting, and there are so many thoughts and points there, but can you react to some of what she said?
Well, the fact of the democratic nations not fighting against each other is indeed a fact. But how one creates democracies and how one defines democracies, as Dr. Carlson was saying, is a real question. You just don't create democracy, and we tried to do that in Latin America. We tried to. It's got to be sort of the thing that happens from within. On top of that, there's so many other sort of things going on in the Middle East besides Israel and Palestinian questions, such as the theocracy of Iran, the authoritarianism and aggressiveness of Iraq, the almost certain fall of the House of Saud. The Saudi Arabian family is not going to be there forever, and when that changes, it will make the Israeli-Palestinian difficulties pale in significance. In addition, of course, the petroleum question of the Middle East, which affects world economy, and then all the rivers of the Middle East, the Jordan River and the Tigris-Euphrates River, all those rivers are major territorial questions and disputes. So there's all that, and that doesn't even mention religious fundamentalism and ethnicity. So the Middle East is so complicated. I was saying earlier, it's kind of an onion. You start peeling it, and there's nothing left when you take the last peel off.
I'm so fortunate to be sitting here with two experts that be able to, what I would call in the program, pick your brain. Janelle and I have been fortunate for many years to do that. I would like to try to peel that onion as it relates to how democracies come into being. This is a really exciting time in which to live, because if I'm correct, there's not much evidence in history that totalitarian or authoritarian systems fall from within or without a violent revolution, and yet the Soviet Union collapsed. And there's a look at China, where it's headed. So I'd like to move in that area to talk about how a country might attempt to bring about a democracy without a world war. And Dr. Carlson, let me start with you. And let's compare the Soviet Union and China, and that might have some history that would be beneficial to the Middle East. With what little knowledge I have on the Soviet Union and its politics, it seems to me that when Gorbachev took power, there was this great debate over glasnost, for example, and perestroika, the political and economic reforms, and shall you do them instantly together? And if I understand this correctly, that was an attempt to do so. And what I hear from the observations that were taking place in China, that they said you can't do both at once. So my very long dissertation is to have you to speak to the political and economic questions and how you perceive as a political scientist how those two are different, how that might affect the growth of democracy in the future in non-democratic countries.
Okay. Let me just back up and touch on a point that was implicit in your question that I think is important for our audience to understand. Prior to 1989, when Eastern European countries had their revolutions, most of the literature on revolutions believed fundamentally that a revolution had to be violent. And we witnessed that in history. Our own revolution was violent, the Russian, the Chinese, the Cuban, the Nicaraguan. And the reason we believed that is because we always assumed that the leadership would never voluntarily give up power, which meant that you had to fight to dislodge them. Eastern Europe in 1989 completely, if I can use the term, revolutionized our thinking about revolutions because the leadership did, in fact, simply step down. And I think a lot of people have argued that that goes to show how ultimately morally rotten and delegitimized the regimes in Eastern Europe had truly become. That even the sort of moderate communists had come to believe that communism no longer held any value in it. And we're starting, I think, to witness that in China now. That starting with the reforms of Deng Xiaoping in 1978 and 1979, he essentially changed the myth that communism was an acceptable way of managing an economy. He began to inject capitalism into the mix, saying, yes, you can have free market, you can have small private plots of land, and so he's beginning to change the economic myth of that society. And what the Chinese students began to do in the mid-1980s is to say, well, if communism is unacceptable on an economic dimension, why is it still acceptable on a political dimension where the average Chinese person does not have input into the allocation of values in that society? And so one of the things that the Chinese leadership has to face in the future is whether they, like Eastern Europe, will also step down simply because communism has become so delegitimized. I think there's a possibility for that because there's a serious split within the communist leadership within China about the direction to go. And it may be a peaceful transition, but should the hardliners stay on and the People's Liberation Army go with the government, you may see a more armed resistance within China and a fractionalization in the countryside.
Compare that with the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Gorbachev, had tried, say, economic first, would the Soviet Union take a somewhat different path or a slower path? There was really a collapse, wasn't there? In the system as they knew it.
It was a collapse, and I think what makes the Soviet case so much more complicated is that you essentially had 15 republics who lived within the Soviet Union that really truly wanted to be autonomous and did not feel that they were Russian. So you've got a lot of religious diversity, ethnic diversity, witness the Chechenian problem. And so even had Gorbachev started like Deng Xiaoping and began economic reforms, you still have all of this dissatisfaction associated with living in the Soviet system that may not be as strong or as prevalent in China, which, although not a homogeneous society, is certainly much more alike than the Soviet Union was. Gorbachev may have staved off the revolution for a time, but I think given the dynamics in that system, it would have been inevitable. Again, because there's a belief that economic liberalism also leads to the demand for political liberalism.
Really, what an excellent point. That's like comparing the United States and Great Britain. They both evolved democracies, but they're different, and the way they did that's different.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes we might be very dangerous to take two different societies and say that they use identical systems and it'll work the same.
Right. Yeah, while they both use communism, the whole societal mix, I think, is very different. And so there's a lot of variables that need to be taken into consideration when we try to project or infer about any kind of causal relationship.
When you get around, what was Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, is much more Western than China,
Exactly.
or the influence of Confucianism. I've often understood that Confucianism got mixed with, they could not eliminate Confucianism with Marxism. They had a different mix.
Right.
Dr. Moore, would like to bring you in on this particular part of the conversation. And how would you forecast what Dr. Carlson's been talking about concerning, is there an outbreak of democracy around the world, and maybe coming at different speeds or levels of development in different parts of the world? And are you optimistic, and do you think this also could lead to someday greater chance for world peace?
Well, I suppose I'm optimistic, but I don't know if that's the political science in me so much as something else. But the Latin America has become much more democratic, certainly civilian, and it's not an American style or even a British style or a French style democracy, but there's democracy in Latin America almost everywhere. Some of it you might call guided democracy, one-party democracy, or one-party dominant democracy, but democracy nonetheless, with opposition being protected and basic minority rights, majority rule type of things. In Africa, which is sort of the real question, one of the great guided democracies there was the Republic of Tanzania, who under this George Washington-like figure, Julius Nyerere, they had a one-party guided democracy. People voted and opposition was within the party, sort of like the Mexican PRI. But in the last 3 years, basically coincidentally with the decline of Soviet communism, they got away from the one-party thing, and now they have a very active 13-party democracy with no one party in the majority. And it's that happened, and then foreign direct investment happened, on a much higher scale in Tanzania. So, that's a case. The other variable besides political and economic, the third variable, is cultural. And you really can't study different political systems without looking at different cultures. Even the U.S. culture and the Canadian culture, if you will, or even the Western Canadian culture and the Quebec and the Eastern, the Atlantic culture. There's varieties there, and if you're to understand how the New Democratic Party got into British Columbia, you don't look for an American model or a Soviet model or anything else. I mean, you have to look at the people that are there and sort of the history that got them there, as well as the economics.
We've interviewed a number of people on this program from Africa that have toured this country and the new democracies, and I take from what they're saying as well as you that, again, on this experimentation with evolution of democracy, that it goes in different stages and forms in different countries. And you present evidence of where the stages are moving, but yet it doesn't have identical forms in other countries. With that, I'll turn to Janelle Burt.
We're living in a very exciting time, but also a time of great change. And globally, we're becoming much smaller. That is, we can access other countries easily, traveling, and also by other means such as the internet, other kinds. Television is universal now. And so can you give some indication how you think governments are going to, what role governments are going to be playing in our lives in the future? And I'll start with Dr. Carlson again. What roles will government be playing, and what roles will these other factors be playing in our lives?
That's an interesting question, because it's, at least on the panel that I was on today and in other forums that I've looked at it, there's really two processes going on simultaneously. On the one hand, you have the integration processes of the European Union, NAFTA, Asia, and APEC, where we're becoming closer and closer and integrated in the globalization process. But at the same time, you have cries for political devolution, where decision making goes closer to the local level. We've witnessed this in Scotland recently. Even in the United States, I think there's a movement to move from the federal back to the state level and to recapture some of states' rights. So as we sort of feel that the process is getting out of control at the global level, we try to bring the political decision making closer to home. One of the consequences I think that's going to result from this is, instead of having the old style one level game where governments talk to governments, Soviets talk to the United States, we moved into a two-level game where, say, Chrysler negotiates with the US government, Toyota negotiates with the Japanese government, and then the two governments negotiate. So you've got simultaneous games. Today on a panel we were talking about a three-level game where organizations, say within the United States, directly negotiate or cooperate with organizations in other states, completely bypassing the state altogether. So in that formulation, states are going to be less important as decision makers as we become more interconnected, because we can make those linkages without the state, which in some ways is a very inefficient translator of preferences.
And economic governments, would you, and I don't think perhaps that's a good terminology, economic governments, but economic unions, perhaps, Dr. Moore?
Well, the blocks, the great blocks that people speak about them all the time. Certainly the European Union and the United States of Europe, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and then President Clinton is down in Latin America now talking to the Mercosur people, and I guess he conferred great nation status on Argentina yesterday. I'm not sure if that's true. And then there's this talk about this Asian bloc, but the reality of all these blocs are that the United States and certainly Japan have increased their trade with the European Union. Even though we've increased our internal NAFTA trade, even with that, we've increased our trade with the European Union and increased our trade with Japan. The interdependence of this thing is so complex right now that it's today I think there's this major confrontation in the ports of the Pacific Coast. We're going to keep Japanese shipping out if they don't cave in as of today and allow American shipping into Japanese ports without paying the port fees. This sort of thing in 1940 or 1935 might have been cause for war, that sort of thing. Now it's going to be a cause for complaint by shippers in the United States they don't want to play the patriotic game, and shippers in Japan who say, yes, we've got to get those American hulls in there, and there's that sort of a thing. The economic regimes, the fishing fleets of the Pacific Coast, BC fleet, Washington fleet, Oregon fleet, at odds with and the Alaska fleet is an important third element. They're at odds with each other. It's hostile, blocking shipping, hard words and all this stuff. And yet at the governor's level, premier governor's level, it's a different thing. And then at the national level, in Ottawa and Washington, D.C., there's no problem at all. It's just, that's that three-tiered thing in large, I suppose.
Now this brings me to a question that's up for grabs with either one of you. But as our world becomes smaller in terms of communication, there are a large number of people who perhaps will be disenfranchised because they do not have access to the internet, to government as we've known it previously. So do one of you have a reaction to that comment, that people would become disenfranchised because of their lack of ability then to access the economic or the communication processes?
You want to take that one, Richard?
I'll start, and then I'll pass it to you quickly as soon as I get in trouble. Certainly, the logic of that is apparent, even within the United States, and we can see kind of a have and have not in terms of information access and processing, and certainly internationally you can see that, undeniably. On the other hand, one of Dr. Carlson's papers on her panel this morning this guy was talking, who was speaking about the Middle East, was talking about globalization. And so although there's going to be haves and have-nots, there's going to be somebody in Hebron, in the West Bank, who's much better informed than the four of us are about what's going on the West Coast as far as Japanese shipping. And so you get this kind of cultural diffusion that's going on worldwide, and it's going to be difficult to sort it out in terms of national boundaries or even social class within a boundary.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I wouldn't have much more to add to that other than to say that I think the internet might be conceptualized as just another technological tool, another advancement in which we've always had haves and have-nots. When we first created newspapers, and those people who couldn't read, they were disenfranchised and left out of the process. So I think you're always going to have that dynamic. The question is, you know, how far that resentment is going to go and how that will manifest itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Dr. Carlson, you have really sparked my concern about another issue. It just goes on and on. And historically, how the evolutionary process goes on. You excited me with your idea that democracies are possibly flourishing and that might be the road to peace. And then you brought in another mix. And that mix is that we may bypass governments and have organization to organization. And as those decisions have great complexities and consequences for people, then I think about voters. They have great control over democracies, but they may not have that control over those organizations. And so do we have the danger of moving from democracies to organizations that are not almost identifiable, and we have no control over the decisions they make that could have great consequences for the human race? I'm speaking impulsively after hearing that comment. So, you and I talked before the show that the genie's out of the bottle, and we don't know all the things that happen, and people certainly can interact all over the world. What do we need to look for there? What will be the role of democracy to make sure that as they do have this direct communication, that they also not violate certain concerns of the public?
Well, one of the issues here...
We have 30 seconds.
We have 30 seconds. Thanks, Tony. One of the things that I think we need to be careful of is that certainly if you witnessed during the Cold War in this country that the public opinion really did not have a lot of impact on foreign policy. I think when economic issues become much more important, you're going to have interest groups that are very mobilized and very interested in getting their views expressed. And so I think governments have to be more sensitive to the fact that their international decisions will affect local people.
Dr. Lisa Carlson and Dr. Richard Moore, thank you. We just got started. We're going to have you back, and I promise we will invite you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed the program as much as we have, and these very bright guests that we've had, and we will have them back, and I would invite you to be with us next week, and we'll discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.